As the title of the lecture indicates, it is about the Brussels crisis and the politics of decline. So I'll speak for 30 minutes, specifically about the kind of crisis that has been engulfing Brussels in the last year and a half. So Brussels has been without a regional government for the last 500 days. That sometimes is a tendency to treat this crisis as something specifically or exclusively Brusselian. But actually, I think it reflects a set of contradictions that are not specific to Brussels, but actually go to the structure of the Belgian state, and then the pressure that is exercised from the European level onto the Belgian state. And of course, the pressure that then emanates from the European level is itself a reflection of a global shift in forces. So I'm trying to see Brussels as part of a much wider macrocosm and show how the Brussels crisis in many ways is in no way separate from the global crisis typical of the middle of the 2020s. So to start, I want to return to a moment last June this year when the European Commission, which many of you who read the European press will also just know as Brussels, itself received a request from Brussels. So why did it receive a request? Well, there were the costs for the renovation of one of the central areas that actually houses most of the European institutions, so-called Place Schuman, where also the Commission is housed. And the costs for that renovation were running over. So with the region's debt levels already very dangerously high, the city Brussels was in desperate need of funds. Now, to some foreigner listeners, this might sound as if the European Union dispatched the request to itself. Yet for most inhabitants of the city, including me, and I guess the majority of the people here in this room, this equation between the European bloc and Brussels is actually anything but self-evident, and it even seems a bit strange. So Brussels, which is Belgium's bilingual capital, is not just home to the EU institutions, which actually only employ about 50,000 people in the most generous estimates. There are even numbers which show that the Paris municipal bureaucracy, so the number of people who work as civil servants for Paris, is higher. And usually, of course, these 50,000 people are stationed in one and the same expat bubble that doesn't always interact with the rest of the city. Brussels has a population of over 1.2 million, and it has its own large city government. And since 1989, it's been one of Belgium's 3 semi-autonomous regions. Now, for one of the most diverse cities in the world, some say even the most diverse city in the world, so 45% of Brusselians are foreign-born. The only city that's more impressive is Dubai, but I think we can kind of agree that Dubai is cheating when we're looking at those numbers. Now, it is a very impressive decade-long experiment in self-rule. And as some of you might also know, that effort to let Brussels govern itself, is under very serious strain. So for over a year and a half, almost 500 days, Brussels has been without a working government. And if you just look outside, and people who walk across the city will surely have noticed it, there are now all kinds of signs of dysfunction which are accumulating. That goes from rising homelessness to crumbling infrastructure, the incapacity to finish the so-called tram line. They're supposed to open a museum, one of the biggest museums in the world, the Canal, further down the road here. And now there has been a call from one of the directors that if they don't receive new funds from the city, they might go bankrupt and the museum will never open. And of course, there are layoffs at many civil society organizations that are financed by the city. There's now even a chance that next year some of the wages of civil servants will remain unpaid. And there's even people who make a comparison with the so-called crisis of New York in the 1970s, which Brussels now seems to have its own equivalent of. Then there's, of course, the issue of escalating drug violence, which has led some people, particularly on the Belgian right, to liken Brussels to a northern Marseille. And all of this now seems to indicate that Brussels is nearing the end of its experiment in urban autonomy. Now, the significance of this crisis and eclipse goes far beyond Belgium or Europe as such. And what I want to show tonight is basically that the Brussels crisis tells us something very important about Europe's place in a 21st century world. And even more crucially for tonight, because of course it is a lecture for the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation, I think it also holds strategic lessons for the left in the second quarter of this 21st century, and what I would tentatively want to call the politics of European decline. Now, I don't want to talk about the politics of Western decline, because I think there are internal differences in the West between particularly the US and Europe, but it's specifically about the politics of European decline and what that politics could be and how that politics could look like from the left. Now, as historians in this room will surely know, decline takes many forms and it doesn't have a single temporal scale. Decline can go very fast, a bit like water changes to ice all of a sudden, or it can creep glacially over centuries. And inevitably, and this has also long been the case in the United Kingdom, decline is also a very important intellectual question for the left, including the question how it can be negotiated strategically and what kind of correctives and options are available against it. Now, the reason I talk about decline so much is not because I'm addicted to pessimism, as some people might say, but there is nowadays a conservative version of declinism that is very familiar to us today, and that's also immensely powerful politically. And the danger there is that this conservative variant of declinism invites solutions which don't share any overlap with those solutions of the left, and I think are even actively hostile to it and might make it more difficult for the left to actually reverse decline. So for instance, the current discourse about the need to remilitarize Europe and thereby also to slash the welfare state through austerity, being waged across all kinds of different European member states, is also justified by a recourse to a discourse of decline, particularly with the idea that the continent is losing its advantage against the US and China and needs to reorder its societies for this competition. I think for those of you who know, one can detect this very strongly in the so-called productivity report compiled by Mario Draghi about a year and a half ago now, where it's also a rhetoric of European decline, or even the rhetoric adopted by the Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever, who both worry about the gap between Europe and the new power blocks forming in the 2020s. Now, this is a politics of decline, but it's a plainly regressive one, and I think it's likely to worsen the disease it purports to diagnose and also remedy. Thereby, I think it requires a very clear-headed left-wing response, namely, if we agree on the fact of decline, what does a left-wing politics of decline actually look like? Now, one left-wing politics of decline, which I think dare not speak its name, that's become particularly popular in the last 5 years, particularly after the kind of cycle of left-wing movements that arose after the crisis of 2008 has receded, is now quite familiar across the European and the Western world. And that is a retreat to the urban level. So as Europe and America lurch further rightward, there have been many liberals, but also people on the socialist left that have cast their eyes on cities rather than national states as somehow the ideal fortresses against reaction and against decline. Just some examples. For example, in Hungary, the mayor of Budapest is one of the leading figures in the opposition to the Orbán regime. And then Warsaw's mayor, of course, in Poland is also a standard bearer of liberalism against the far right. In Italy, we can think of Bologna, which still has a status as a haven of resistance against the right, which is now firmly in power, of course, under the post-fascist Giorgia Meloni. And then in the United States, and this is highly contemporary, certainly given yesterday's spectacular election results, we have the sanctuary cities across America, which defy Trump's immigration orders. But there's also obviously first the primary win, but now the actual mayoral victory by Zoran Mamdani, which has kind of rekindled hopes of what they call sewer socialism or an urban American socialism. Now, many people have often treated Brussels as a kind of precedent for this left-wing urban politics. There's a very long discourse that's become recently more popular, but that's actually much older and dates to the 90s and the 2000s. Think of theorists such as Saskia Sassen as well, of cities against states. The most famous exponent of this theory is, of course, the Belgian philosopher Philippe van Parijs, who himself is from Brussels, lives in Brussels, who usually presents Brussels as a kind of laboratory for left-wing politics. And there are, of course, powerful precedents for this urban left-wing politics. So left-wing traditions of municipalism, as it's called. We can think of Red Vienna in the 1920s, when the Austrian Social Democrats rebuilt the city out of the ashes of the First World War, to, of course, Ken Livingstone, so a famous Labour figure, his mayoralty of London in the 1980s. Now, Brussels, I don't think, has the same rich left-wing history. It actually historically is interestingly also quite a right-wing city. The Liberals have a very long tradition of having bastions here in Brussels. But at the same time, it's now obvious that in the 21st century, Brussels has increasingly moved to the left. And during the recent attempts to form a regional government, there was even a hope that a so-called large left-wing bloc could form a coalition. So the PTB, the Workers' Party, or the Communists, and then the Walloon Socialists and the Greens, and then a couple of Flemish parties would get together and form a coalition. That didn't come to pass because many particularly left-wing parties, thought it was basically a trap. Now, the reason it's proven so immensely difficult, and I'm just going to go through some basics of Brusselian politics. For those of you who know this, I'm sorry that I have to repeat this. For those of you who don't, you do have to listen carefully because it is spectacularly complicated, but we'll just go from A to B to make sure everyone's on the same page. So we have a very strangely decentralized system when it comes to municipal power in Brussels. So it's spread over 19 municipalities, which each has their own mayor and their bureaucracies. And over these, of course, towers this regional government, which actually consists of a bipartisan coalition between Flemish and Francophone politicians, each elected on their own lists. And each list then has to form its own majority without interference from the other side. Now, for decades since 1990, so when the Brussels region was first formed, this baroquely complex arrangement actually appeared to work. So what happened is that you had a majority that was formed on the Flemish side and then one that was formed on the Francophone side, and after which a combined coalition was able to govern with also the ministerial posts split between both of these coalitions. Now, what happened after the elections 500 days ago in June 2024, however, these old rules began to break down. So the Francophone socialists, the Parti Socialiste, refused to work with the Flemish nationalists on the other side in Brussels. And then later, even the French-speaking liberals of the MR refused to rule with a new minority party called Team Fouad Ahida, which is often just called a Muslim party. I don't think it's quite a fair description, but that was ostensibly the reason why they refused to enter a coalition. Now, of course, predictably, the result has been total deadlock. And what we see is that the credit rating of Brussels as a region, its capacity to borrow, is steadily worsening. And it's almost a mathematical certainty that any future Brussels government will have to agree to some kind of austerity program, and slash budgets. Now, with the city's drug violence worsening, so this summer over 20 shootings were recorded, although there's an estimate there might even be more, there's now the foresight of what they call the nuclear option. And this means that the federal government takes over the Brussels government and then basically tends it as if it was a vassal state. Now, very ominously, the leader of the federal government, Prime Minister Bart De Wever, has actually derided Brussels, the region, as a failed state. So these are his words. And he's actually hinted at an international monetary fund-like treatment. So a bit like the European institutions treated Greece in the euro crisis of 2015. Now, there is some kind of legal capacity to do this coup without making it illegal, and this could happen through a so-called constitutional loophole. So in one of the constitutions that was composed in 1989, when Belgium became a fully federal state, there is one article that stipulates that if the international role of Brussels as a haven for the European institutions is under threat, the federal government can decide to act as a guardian of its budget. Now, we're 500 days further after the elections. The government still hasn't been formed. The problems are accumulating. So why hasn't this federal coup d'etat actually happened? So why didn't they just do it straight away when it was clear that the blockage was going to continue? Now, 500 days ago, this might have sounded very, very improbable. But at the end of this year, there's actually a legitimate question whether the Brussels region is going to make it to the end of, or the start even, of 2026. So there's a recent list of resignations in the interim government. So the Minister of Budget, Sven Gatz, from the Liberal Party on the Flemish side, actually resigned, presumably because of mental health issues, but I think I have a better idea on why he resigned. There were further revelations about highly creative budgeting strategies, where all kinds of numbers were cooked up that were nowhere to be found. And now, most dramatically this week, there have been stalled negotiations about the capacity to form some kind of coalition that could vote in parliament without forming a government on 1 billion euros. But then you have the resignation of the last negotiator, namely David Lester, who's from the Francophone Liberals. And all of this basically adds up to a situation in which it's very unclear that Brussels will actually exist as an independent region and entity at the start of the year. Now, the question is, why has this coup not taken place yet? So why has the federal government simply not decided to take over the Brussels government? Well, I mean, there's an intuitive reason, namely that the vast majority of the parties in the federal government actually benefit more from a deterioration than an amelioration of the Brussels situation. Their voters live elsewhere, let's say in regional Wallonia or in Flanders, so that's not what they get their votes. And they've always wanted to get rid of what they call the left-wing firebrand in the region. And this antipathy is even more explicit now that the federal government itself has opted for a historic round of austerity measures. And I think, and of course I'm not an astrologist, I'm not confident making predictions, it's only when the abyss is truly going to loom, so when there's another degradation in the credit rating of the Brussels region, or when, for example, the civil servants here can no longer be paid, then I think they will seriously consider putting to an end the Brussels experiment in self-government. Now, I now want to talk about the question, what makes Brussels specific and what makes it universal? Because if it's purely specific, then there's nothing to be said about the sort of broader left-wing attempt to retreat to the urban in the 2020s, and Brussels is just a case apart, and there's nothing actually to be said about it. But then in the end, I do want to indicate that there's a kind of universal dimension to Brussels, which is very important, which holds lessons for the kind of politics of decline in Europe that I'm talking about. So we nowadays have several explanations for why it's been so difficult to form a government. A very popular one is just mutual alienation between Flemish and French-speaking politicians. So it's just an expression of an age-old language divide. Some other people talk about the extremely low quality of the current batch of policymakers. It's just generationally a very weak group of politicians. And then some others just point at the overdetermined fact that the whole structure of the Belgian federal state is so immensely complex that it's basically a miracle that it even worked before 2024. And the question is not why is it not working now, the question is why did it work in the 2000s and 2010s, because this looks just insanely complicated to even make it work. Now, I think there's certainly something to be said for that exceptionalism, the idea that there's something specific at Brussels. So if you look back at the 19th century, there's a very famous poem by the Belgian poet Émile Verhaeren about the so-called tentacular city. And there he already notices some unique features of Brussels vis-à-vis other European sister cities. Now, some of you might also notice, but there's something very strange about Brussels urban development, which is very different, for example, from the center-periphery dynamic you get in a city like Paris. The rich mostly live in the center and the periphery gets progressively poorer, while here the socio-economic divide is not concentric, but it's more horizontal. It's the north that's particularly poor and the south that's richer. And that already shows that there is something specific and exceptional about Brussels, also because it didn't have the typical kind of red industrial belts you get in most other big European cities. Now, of course, to this we have to add the language divide, where Brussels basically started out as a majority Flemish-speaking or Flemish dialect-speaking city in the 19th and the early 20th century, became majority Francophone, particularly after the Second World War, when many of the Flemings actually left to go and live in Flemish suburbia. And then recently, in the last 10 years, while, let's say, in the beginning of the 2000s, almost 100% of Brusselians spoke French, that's only now 81%. So they've been reduced from a totality to a relative majority, which obviously means there's now 19% of Brusselians that speak neither Dutch nor French, so the official languages of the city. And then you could say the crisis, once again, is supremely logical. A city that doesn't really have a Leitkultur, as they say in German, or it doesn't have a shared identity, is just an aggregation of strangers, and together those strangers will simply lack the civic spirit to overcome the current crisis. All of that is true. I do not want to deny there's something exceptional about Brussels, but we tend to exaggerate how exceptional it is as well. So there are many other large cities that also have to survive as a collection of multilingual minorities. We think about Vienna, Berlin, or New York. And there too, we see highly confusing overlaps between the municipal, the national, the regional, or the federal. And the fact that many of the so-called experts on Brussels actually take their inspiration from those cities already shows that there is some commonality. So, for example, Philippe Van Parijs, the Belgian philosopher I spoke about, has actually proposed a kind of Vienna model for Brussels, where he says Brussels should remain one region, but it should fuse all its different municipalities into one municipality, just like the city of Vienna. And then there's even the proposal that Brussels should be governed by the European institutions, a bit like Washington in the United States. So that already shows that there's enough similarity with those cases to say that you could reform Brussels with these models. And of course, this kind of alienation between the capital and its hinterland is also by no means specifically Brusselian. I think many Germans in this room know that provincial Germans really like to complain about Berlin, which they see as a kind of cosmopolitan enclave. New York is often even cast as a kind of European city and not an American city. So once again, that is not unique to Brussels. Now then, a stronger argument that's often made is that Brussels is unique because it doesn't actually have fiscal power in its own hands. It doesn't actually control the way it taxes and spends those taxes, because that lies outside, mainly in the Flemish region or on the level of the federal government. So the main source of Brussels' income lies outside of the city. But that, again, is not unique. So some of you might know this as well, and it's important in light of the recent New York election, the city of New York is not the capital of the state New York in the United States. The capital of the state New York is the provincial town of Albany, up the Hudson River, which is an old Rust Belt town in which, frankly, there is nothing to do. And that's the place where the city's taxes are actually collected and distributed. This also sets very sharp limits on New York's power as an urban center. So even after the victory of Mamdani in the primaries, there were already warnings, particularly from conservative Democrats, that each plan he had to be approved by Albany, which were very, very unenthusiastic about his version of left-wing politics. We can, of course, also talk about multilingualism, but once again, that's not unique to Brussels. So you have cities such as Barcelona or Zurich that have navigated a multilingual population for decades. And in Asia, of course, monolingualism is by no means the norm. Now, there is one specific difference with these previous cases that I do want to highlight, and that makes Brussels quite unique. You might have residents of Munich in Bavaria that claim that they are financing a libertine Berlin that doesn't know how to spend its money. But those Bavarians don't make any claim for the need to represent Bavaria on Berlin political lists. So while the Flemings insist that they should have Flemish lists in Brussels, the Bavarians don't demand that of Berlin. And this means that the kind of specific linguistic division of the Belgian state, where Brussels is kind of an institutional orphan, actually makes it enormously difficult to form coalitions precisely because there are two other regions that are also making demands on it. We can also read this in a material sense as an expression of different power relations. A significant portion of the German and the American business elite are still stationed in cities such as New York or Berlin. In Belgium, however, it's much more complicated. So the country's economic elite has mostly moved to Antwerp, which is the real center of capital accumulation here, while the class of politicians that governs Belgium from Brussels actually doesn't identify with Brussels very strong. This means that Brussels basically lacks a kind of recognizable urban elite which could basically be responsible for the city. This role is very weakly fulfilled by the members of the Euro bubble, who are often quite mobile and distant from their own city. Many of them also don't pay taxes here, so obviously they don't even have a direct stake in it. Then you have a class of, let's say, prominent Flemish cultural figures that usually are here as well, but they're not really in a position of leadership and they tend to lose against the right on the Flemish level. And that means that Brussels therefore lacks a kind of upper segment which can directly govern its own city, except for, of course, the class of specifically Brussels regional politicians who have shown themselves to be so epically incompetent in the last 10 years. Now, what has mainly happened in that class? Well, the reason that the government has been impossible to form has to do with one specific figure, namely the leader of the Brazilian socialist Ahmed Laouej, who in the summer of 2024 said that he would not be governing with a Flemish majority on their side that included the Flemish nationalists. So he said, I do not want to govern with the NVA, the Flemish nationalists, who also deliver the prime minister because they're xenophobic and anti-Brussels, and therefore we cannot form a government. Now, there's been a lot of analysis that focuses on the kind of personal egoism of Laouej, but I think actually that story obscures that he's not acting alone, but he's actually acting in the name of his broader socialist party that sees the participation in a potential austerity government as a fatal threat. So in 2024, for the first time, the Parti Socialist or the Francophone Socialists were relegated to the opposition on every level on the Belgian state, on the regional, on the federal, and perhaps also on the Brazilian one, the first time since 1987. And that is very strange because there's a very dominant narrative in Brussels and abroad that kind of sees the Parti Socialist as a kind of political veteran. And so the last mass party in Western Europe, there was even a moment where the Walloon Socialists had more members than the French Socialists, which is an absolutely amazing number. So there's 4.5 Walloons and there's 80 million French people, and the Walloon Socialists had more members in their socialist party. That is now over. So there are many numbers that show that in the last 10 years, the Parti Socialiste in the south has lost tens of thousands of members, particularly we think because many of them simply died. So they've now been reduced from 80,000 members to less than 40,000 members, and they're incredibly worried about how this erosion might continue. They now have a response to this threat. They want to refound themselves as a party. They're doing surveys among academics. They want to consult their members and voters. They want to review the relationship with the Socialist Union here in Belgium, and they might even try to find a new name. Now, whether this will succeed is a different question, but at least it explains why Lauwers is so intransigent here in the Brussels context. He's managed to retain some of his classical voter base here, and the idea that if he participates in an austerity government, that will only further discredit him as a socialist is very, very obvious. And I think this is really the deadlock that makes Brussels specific, but at the same time, there is a universality to it, namely, what does it mean for the left to retreat to the urban level when there are now types of crises that can simply not be tackled on that level? So for all its Belgian particularities, Brussels does reveal a much wider truth. In an era of stagnation and reaction, the appeal of municipal politics is very clear. You can sidestep the national government, which is increasingly lodged in the hands of the right, and instead you can try and improve people's lives closer to home. Yet it also offers a very important lesson in realism and the limits of urban power in the 2020s. So even in an age of deglobalization or reglobalization, it's very clear that national power will always constrain urban autonomy when national power itself is constrained by supranational constraints and by increasingly global constraints as well. Now, I think this is a particularly tricky question for the European left, which is, as I said, recovering from this cycle of protest that mainly arose after the 2010s. The crisis of the 2010s is not that of the 2020s. I think the terrain has shifted under our feet. We found ourselves on new ground, and we have to think about what kind of instruments might be suitable for that. Now, of course, the Brussels crisis thereby has to do with the pressure that's coming from the Belgian level that's engaged in austerity. And of course, that Belgian level itself is only enacting that austerity because it's been demanded by the European Union. Why is the European Union demanding this? Well, I mean, there are two particular imperatives that are really crucial there. That's the question of deindustrialization and remilitarization. So those two processes, which have really accelerated in Europe in the last 5 years, are entangled, but they're not the same, and we kind of have to treat them on a case-by-case basis. Now, for the first, remilitarization, as everyone in this room will know, the Belgian government, like all other NATO country members, of course, there's not a perfect correspondence between EU member states and NATO member states, but there's obviously a very strong interaction. So the Belgian government has committed itself to meeting that 5% spending target on defense, which itself can be disaggregated into 3.5% purely on military expenditure and then 1.5% on infrastructure. Now, many people see this as a new demand on behalf of the Trump administration, but actually it's a very old one. It goes back to Obama, who already insisted that the Europeans should pay for their own defense capacity. Biden also continued. And it's really this long stretch of American pressure to make the European Union or the Europe rely on its own defense capacity that is now expressing itself. Now, whether the current plan to spend 5% is actually going to solve the question of Europe's strategic autonomy is a very open question for several reasons. So the first is the initial payouts of that money will not go to European defense producers who are not competitive on a global scale. And they're often, of course, scattered across different national systems. Instead, the first benefactors will be American defense companies, who are a very prominent part of Trump's coalition as well, who can then insist on renewing these contracts after a while. So for instance, this is just one data point, there's no European defense company that actually appears in the top 10 of the most profitable companies in terms of layover. And there now is a hope also in Germany that you can kind of kill two birds with one stone. So you can remilitarize Europe, make it militarily independent, and at the same time also reindustrialize Europe by basically switching industrial capacity to armament production. And the idea is basically that you transfer the industrial workflow. So, for example, an Audi factory towards a military factory. This is also the hope that some have had for a factory that is here in Brussels, namely Audi Vorst, where Theo Franke, so the current Minister of Defense, wants to turn that into an arms manufacturer. That hasn't happened here in Brussels. And even in Germany, where there's been some switching, the results are very ambiguous. And so many engineers from closed car factories were sent to Rheinmetall, but then it's only a fraction, or let's say a quarter of the workforce that can actually find work there. So the very idea that you can remilitarize and reindustrialize at the same time is now shown itself to be very illusory. If we take a step back, we can kind of see that this is a very strange rendering of European autonomy. So it's going to mainly give money to American armaments companies, and it's not going to solve the industrial problem. It's going to deepen American influence in Europe and thereby make Europe more subordinate to the US rather than making it independent. And the fact that many European politicians are so wedded to the idea of a US-led world order, so they're still high on Fukuyama even 30 years after he published his book, and they find it very hard to adjust to the new power realities of the 2020s. I think it bodes very, very dangerously for the prospects for strategic autonomy. That is remilitarization. The final point is deindustrialization. And it's very clear that the kind of benefits which European industry had in the 2010s, and when I say European industry, I obviously mean German industry, German car industry mainly. They had captive markets here in Europe. They could practice wage repression at home. They could delay the green transition. So most of you will remember that they actually manipulated certain cars to decrease their emissions. They had a steady access to these massive Chinese markets. All of that is now over. So many German car makers are actually being prized out of many of their markets, particularly through the boom in Chinese electric vehicle production, which are now basically penetrating all kinds of markets that were previously considered inaccessible. Now, the effects of this German deindustrialization on the surrounding economies, not just, for example, in Hungary and Poland, but also here, are very severe. And so the most high-performing sectors here in Belgium, for example, the Flemish maritime zone around Antwerp, actually have a very close connection to the German export regime and usually adjust their own policies to its rhythm. And instead of actually thinking about what it would mean to solve this industrial crisis on a European scale through, for example, public investment, what someone like Bart de Wever, who in many ways is very closely tied to the maritime zone I spoke about, is actually completely submitting and enthusiastically endorsing the European austerity consensus. So there's going to be some limited spending in certain tactical sectors, but the kind of public spending that actually made, let's say, Chinese car production so effective is nowhere near on the horizon. And that means also that the possibility of some kind of economic rapprochement with China, where the question becomes how can you cooperate with them, for example, on questions of the green transition, now seems further and further out of reach, precisely because many European policymakers simply seem to want Europe to provincialize into some kind of American outpost. I think this is very different from the kind of field that the European left confronted in 2011-2012 when the Euro crisis first got out. There was always a problem of pan-European coordination at the time, namely how could, let's say, Syriza get support in France when there was not a left-wing government in France. But now, where there's been this European austerity consensus on remilitarization that's not actually going to solve the problem, this coordination becomes even more crucial. And that means that the retreat to urban levels and the retreat to urban power is just fatally dangerous. Already in the 2010s, there was this critical weakness for the left on the national level, is that it basically had to do a left-wing politics without the typical constituency that was available to it in the 20th century, which is an organized labor movement or a densely organized labor movement. And this is, of course, the result of the kind of long assault on organized labor that took off in the 1980s and accelerated even in the 1990s. And this means that now there's a lot of political energy that can get translated, and there's all kinds of movements and party projects that arise. But since they don't have this component of organized labor to go with it, and they usually find it difficult to find the right organizational infrastructures for it, the energy dissipates as quickly as it rises. So together with the question of the newly global scale of these crises and then the impermanence of the strategies that were tested in the 2010s, it just means that you have to be even more specific about what your left-wing strategy means in the 2020s, because it's not the world of the 2010s, and in many ways it requires even different approaches. Now, I think there is an alternative, both in an internal and an external sense. And that means there needs to be a program on what the organizational strategy is on a national, regional, European, but then also externally on a global level. There has to be a question of how new parties can be formed out of all the kind of protest movements that we've seen in the last 10 years. where there's bursts of political energy that find their way into the public sphere but find it very difficult to translate themselves into actual institutions. And this does have to imply the building of parties. Now, this can't just be the building of digital parties, as we sometimes see nowadays, for example, in the United Kingdom, where the fact that you choose a very loose party structure in which there's all kinds of different digital membership models that are available actually makes it difficult for you to construct the kind of party you want to construct. But you also need parties that are strong enough to operate both on a municipal, regional, national, and European level. This means this multi-level approach was already important in the 2010s, but it becomes existential in the 2020s. Now, of course, the idea is not to clone the dinosaur of 20th century mass politics and simply put it into that contemporary environment. So it's a bit like Jurassic Park. You take these older creatures and you put them into a new environment. That type of mass party is not going to survive into the new ecosystem today. At the same time, there clearly are options for what you could call hybrid parties that are somewhere between, let's say, a digital and then a classical mass party. And I actually think that the Belgian Workers' Party I previously mentioned has offered some really interesting suggestions on how that might work. They basically have some kind of concentric membership model. They have an inner circle of classical militants who do most of the party work and who pay a large part of their personal salary into party coffers. Then they have a second tier of, let's say, monthly or more impermanent members that contribute to election campaigns and other types of activity, but that don't commit their entire lives to the party. And then they have a third tier, which is much weaker and can, let's say, only in election time be mobilized. But clearly this approach has paid off, and they've now grown to a record number of 30,000 members, combined with very strong internal training programs. There are obviously downsides to this hybrid approach as well. So something between a digital and a mass party. The PTB is also a record spender on social media and on, for example, TikTok. This means that its rhetoric of class war, which it still used to have in the 80s and 90s, is not often as present on those digital channels as before. But clearly the way they've been able to combine, let's say, classical 20th century recipes and more contemporary types of mobilization is very promising. So I'd say this is the internal plan, party formation in this hybrid sense that can operate both municipally, regionally, nationally, and also on a European level, because as I indicated, the question of deindustrialization and remilitarization has to be solved on this higher level. Now, what this means externally is, of course, an attempt to at least lose some of the Atlanticist or pro-American reflexes which are so ingrained, particularly with European policy elites. And what this means is, hopefully, critical integration with China instead of decoupling. And when I say critical, I mean it in a double sense. Critical because it's very important, but also critical that it does come with preconditions. It's not an attempt to say we should simply subordinate ourselves to China, but say, well, how can there be productive cooperation? Together with European joint ventures, particularly for green energy and public investment, most importantly on a European level, that rejects the austerity dogma. Now, I don't only think that this approach is beneficial for Europe, because the European car industry or the German car industry is no longer competitive. It actually has something to learn from the Chinese car industry at this point, but it's also existential for humanity. The vast majority of carbon emissions are now Chinese. Without China, there's not going to be a green transition. So the question is not what should Europeans do to save the climate, but how can they assist the key actor that's actually going to drive the green transition and make it so that in the meantime, there can be some kind of green industrial revival within Europe as well. Now, when I put it this way, both in terms of the internal strategy and the external strategy, that all seems highly logical. But in the minds of European policymakers, that's clearly not the case because they're still reading Fukuyama and they actually haven't moved on from 1989. Now, I think it is up to us to offer some kind of different politics of decline in Brussels or in Europe, which can't restrain itself to the urban level and also has to think about what the global implications are there. Because if there's no alternative to the right-wing politics of decline, that's basically going to remain the only game in town. And Europe is going to become irrelevant in a very inelegant way. So decline can be elegant, but I don't think the current version of European decline is in any way going to be fun or beautiful to watch. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was nice and comprehensive. let's move on from Europe a little bit and go to where everybody's mind was today, to to New York, to Mamdani. I woke up this morning and the first thing I see is the cover of the New York Post. Maybe some of you have seen it as well. It was basically Mamdani holding up a hammer and a sickle and some reference to Marx in the headline. And at first I thought it was a meme, right? Because the memes were great. The memes were great today. But it was just bourgeois tears, actually. It was truly that. And it's funny because when the Belgian Workers' Party, so the PTB, comes out with commonsensical policy proposals just like Zoran's, so, tax the rich, make public transport free, build social housing, cap rents and food prices, come up for Palestine, move key industries into public hands, you can be sure that there will be an editorial in the bourgeois press the next day referencing Stalin or Mao or the Red Scare in general. And it's not coincidental that they always go there, because after all, the socialist proletarian states in the Eastern Bloc, which were large-scale modernization projects, first and foremost, that lifted workers from poverty and gave them housing and education as public goods and so on. One of the main things that made them so successful, in addition to a solid theory of the future, of a common future, was that they didn't have to deal with an organized bourgeoisie sabotaging their plans because they had abolished it, which is a dream. Of course, in the West, we don't have such victories to our name yet. So the bourgeoisie remains the obstacle to realizing a socialist vision. They won't let themselves be taxed. They consistently suppress social investments. They maintain this intricate funding system that allows the federal to define the municipal. So they sabotage the left using all these tools. In short, they are very organized. So what do you think Mamdani will have to deal with? Beyond the Albany connection, which will obviously, they will sabotage him as much as they can. But what compromises is he likely to make? Are you hopeful? Are you not so hopeful? And I already saw, and I think this is something we should all take to heart, I already saw that he reminded people in his speech that the struggle requires a lifelong commitment. So it's not just for the duration of the campaign.
Yes, enormously important question. And it obviously directly relates, not, let's say, we could call it the New York crisis and the politics of American decline. But that will be a different lecture because I do think the parameters are not the same. The first thing I'll say, this lecture might have come across as deeply pessimistic, but I do feel very hopeful also about last night's result. Also because it shows that there's a kind of mobilizational capacity that's similarly hybrid. So the fact that there was a very impressive social media campaign on behalf of the Mamdani camp, and at the same time there was a ground operation that was very well run. So people would have seen certain ads online or even on television, and then at the same time people would actually knock on the doors. It clearly shows that that approach has real potential. The only other thing I'd mention is that the enthusiasm that's there seems to me to suffer from some kind of short-termism, and I've already mentioned it. Many people already said this when he won the primary. New York doesn't actually control its own fiscal capacity. They often have to defer, as I said, to Albany, to the state level, where, of course, the power of the Republican, particularly the Democratic bloc, is much stronger. And this means that many of the plans that Mamdani has will have to have some kind of approval from Albany. And it's not very clear it's going to be easy to get that. Now, of course, there are things you can do on purely a municipal level, but they always remain constrained by that state level. And then there's the additional threat that was made by Trump just after his victory was announced that there's going to be cuts in federal funding. And so with a left-wing mayor in place in New York, the federal government is actually going to control the revenue stream that goes towards it. And then what they'll basically try to do is bleed him dry and say, well, there's all these things you want to do. You want to make public transport free. You want to solve the housing crisis. We're not going to give you any funds for that. I think some of these threats seem a bit cheap. I'm not entirely sure people will actually follow through on them. And then there's obviously just the question that if you can coordinate, let's say, with certain other left-wing parliamentarians or people in Congress, then there might be an opportunity to get pressure on other levels, because if it doesn't work purely on the New York level, you have to exercise pressure on other levels. But again, speaks to the point I'm trying to make, is that only doing Mamdani's program on the level of New York seems very dangerous. You have to have some kind of backup on another level. The final point I'll make is that even if he now starts to implement his program, wants to do all these things, at least making visible these contradictions and at least showing everyone where real power lies and what the actual structure is of the American state and how it interacts, particularly with its capitalist class, that is a highly educational experience. And of course, I don't want to make the comparison with Syriza because that's a miserable comparison to make. But at least what Syriza made very explicit in its confrontation with the Eurozone authorities is how power is actually distributed, what it looks like, what the reality of this system is. Now, I don't think the right lessons were learned from it. I don't think that much was pedagogically taken from it. But it is an immensely useful lesson just in revealing the anatomy of a system that wasn't visible before. So on the one hand, I'd say the threats seem a bit cheap, so I think he should just go ahead. At the same time, yes, there will be pressure from other levels, whether it's Albany or Washington. Once that happens, there has to be a question of how you can exercise pressure together with other actors to weaken the opposition. And if that doesn't work, you still have to insist on, to use the beautiful phrase, intensifying those contradictions by basically showing what the actual structure is of the American state. And in that sense, yes, I'm relatively hopeful. I do think people are getting extremely excited about something that might be extremely difficult. The hostility was already there. It's now fully in the open, and the question just becomes, how long will it last? I don't think there's going to be like a Pinochet-style coup on New York. I don't think the Americans are going to do that in the 2020s. But, I mean, there are many strategies to kill the project.
Yeah, because the organized bourgeoisie, as I said, is a problem. So then perhaps for Brussels, we don't need a local urban elite, as you mentioned in your speech, to live locally and take the city's interests at heart, because those aren't usually compatible with the interests of the working class. And I'm thinking of the example of my own city in Romania, Cluj, which is in the northwest of the country. It's flushed with IT capital. It's certainly under the thumb of a local bourgeoisie, which is quite independent from the center, from the capital. And they guide city hall policies towards their own interests, public funds flowing into real estate projects, cheap appropriation of formal industrial sites, low public investment, exploding rents, insufficient public schools, but a few expensive private ones that only the rich can afford, pollution redirected to the periphery where working class neighborhoods still endure. And you will maybe not be surprised to hear that it's called the 5-star city of Eastern Europe. It's called Silicon Valley of Eastern Europe. It's called the best city in Eastern Europe because it panders to these middle class and upper middle class aesthetics and goals. But if we are not loyal to those, we should perhaps focus on disorganizing the bourgeoisie. For example, through undermining the power of the large real estate developers, as they are called, the barons de béton, by blocking their destructive projects, and that can be done on municipal level. I've seen it happen in Molenbeek, my commune, bad reputation, great place, where the PTB is in the ruling coalition, and they're doing great work in that way. There's also a way to push for example, to push for public investments to not be included when calculating budget deficits, as they're happily doing now for militarization. So it is possible. And of course, there's the Red Vienna model, taxing the rich, building public housing, and curbing speculation. And this brings me to the question of power, because there will be differences across territories, of course. But what should the European left do with the question of power? And by left, I'm gonna define it. By left, I mean left of social democracy, because as far as I'm concerned, social democrats have proven that they are handmaidens of neoliberalism. They vote for war credits already from a century ago, and to today. You mentioned the retreat to municipalism. I mentioned that I think the PTB, which is my party, full disclosure, is doing great work there. Despite the fact that they're suffering under the defunding sabotage from the federal level. They inherited a horrible situation from the right-wing MR. But they managed to pursue important things in terms of housing policy and other things. And of course, they may be dismissed as reformism. But from my perspective, anything that helps destabilize capital is a good thing and is chipping away to their power. And they also do a great thing underlining a very important aspect about crime. You mentioned crime and the wave of crime in Brussels. And of course, the answer from the hard right is always to put more police on the streets. It's always carceral. But of course, the left wing, the proper left response is that crime is a problem of poverty. So just by increasing police budgets and centralizing command, which the right loves to do because police is useful in repressing resistance, we should instead improve the lives of the working class and especially the youth, and rather focus and channel funds into that. But at the national level, power, the question of power, and not just in Belgium, I think the PTB here is focusing on advancing the working class ideologically, which is very important to be ready for the rendezvous with history, let's say, when it calls, and also helps organize and mobilize and so on. But should the left in general, in other places maybe, stay away from power within the bourgeois state to avoid discrediting itself, which has happened again and again through history, and instead focus on refining its ideology, because in other parts of Europe, especially, the ideology is not always very clear and coherent, and to mounting a solid opposition to delay austerity in this particular case. Or are there circumstances where it is a good idea to be in power? And you can talk briefly about the different European countries if you want, but I'm particularly interested in what's going on in the UK. And they have their specificities in the electoral system.
Yes, so there's a variety of dimensions to be examined there. Though there is a clear sense in which the argument I'm presenting is not an argument against municipal activity as such in any way. It's about the exclusive focus on it and the idea that you can just retreat to the city as a way of surviving or shielding yourself from all these hostile developments in the 2020s, when at the same time the question is rather, well, if you have the municipal activity, how does it complement or how does it interact with the other levels I'm talking about? Because if you look at the trajectory, let's say, of Podemos, but even of Corbynism, as that long cycle of the 2010s came to an end, there was an attempt to make a national bid for power, both in the Spanish and the British case. Then it ran into limits. Now, Podemos obviously actually entered into government with the socialists, but not as a senior, but as a junior partner. And now it's basically disintegrating fully as a political force. Corbynism, in a different electoral system, lost an election. And then the reflex immediately was to say, we'll go back to Barcelona, or we'll go back to Preston, or we'll go back to our part of London, where we can still, on a local level, do the kind of things we weren't able to do on the national level. And it's completely understandable as a response to defeat, but given the challenges of the 2020s, I think that's simply not going to suffice. And at least there's a consciousness of that in the UK case. So the fact that there's now an attempt to create a post-Corbyn left, which is independent from the Labour Party, indicates that there's both an appetite for this with the population, and at the same time, there is political personnel that clearly wants to do something with it. The question is, as I already hinted, what does the party look like? And the kind of models you have for the Your Party, and other people call it Our Party, I think there's already an interesting rhetorical difference between those two names for the parties, is that the kind of hybrid model which the PTB has managed to adopt here is something they're actually not very good at reproducing. So either they go for a party that's so flexible and so loose that people just come and go all the time and it just becomes a vehicle for careerists, or it just becomes a very cohesive sect that cannot actually let any outsiders in. And I think the British left for the last 30 years has particularly been caught between these two extremes. So either just a pure movementist digital cloud that's both everywhere and nowhere, or a kind of small sectarian church that, of course, survives across the ages, but doesn't actually draw any new members in and can thereby not translate political energy. And I do think the PTB has struck some kind of midway option that's much more promising. When it comes to the participation question, and that obviously also applies to the idea that I think, for example, critical integration with China and learning from the miracle of green productivity that's now happening in China at the time. The question then becomes, what does that mean in terms of participating in governments? I don't think it necessarily entails that you have to become form part of a government. There are just certain red lines you build that, let's say, you have certain conditions on which you enter a coalition. So you say, here are our aims, or here are our targets we want in terms of social housing, we want in terms of industrial policy, we want in terms of green production. Those are the limits, or let's say the hard red lines we'll enter with. Once the government is enacting its policies and we can see that they're not being met, we're immediately going to leave. That's not the same thing as completely moving into the state apparatus and basically collapsing yourself into the state. It means that you can give conditional support to certain projects, which I do think is important, particularly on the question of European reindustrialization, but without then meaning that you're going to move the party entirely out of government and out of society. Because that, I think, is the central contradiction of reformism, is that once you get into the state to do the reforms that you promise to your own constituency, once you're in the state, you're doing something very different. And the task, I think, is just to be highly conditional about what your support for certain policies means. And once those are not met, you can immediately retreat and you can go back to the social basis you've built. Now, I know that doesn't sound very sexy. It does certainly not plea for some kind of revolutionary break. But I don't think we're even in a pre-revolutionary situation in Europe nowadays. We really have to think about what options are on the table. And I do think, particularly in the question of how you combine this with some kind of response to the ecological crisis, well, that response has to revolve around China. And if it has to revolve around China, it's more of a question of how do you reorient European countries and the European Union in their current stance towards China, which obviously also has massive implications for the question of the Atlantic Alliance and the military budgets I spoke about, which are a distraction from this task of the green transition. And it's not, I'd say, a question on how you can have a revolutionary break tomorrow by gathering everyone in the streets and calling a general strike. I don't think that's a productive time horizon to talk about. I'm optimistic that maybe in my lifetime we will be able to have that conversation, but I simply think that the kind of politics of decline I'm talking about necessitates a certain kind of modesty. And I know I sound like a traitor here, but that is simply the case.
No, I think you're being realistic and it's useful because definitely the EU seems to have settled into a vassality position towards the EU, and especially Eastern Europe is a hyper tool of U.S. interests. But let's talk about militarization.
Yeah.
As probably we are all aware, huge amounts of public money start flowing into de-risking the military industry, which means they get money from the state to make their factories, to advance their investments, but the profits stay private, which is the big scheme at the heart of capitalism, actually. And the excuse is Russia, just like the Soviet Union was the excuse in Hitler's time. The parallels are just mind-boggling. The warmongering propaganda from Brussels is relentless and sometimes ridiculous. I don't know if you follow it, but Ursula von der Leyen took to Twitter last week to urgently call for a drone wall on the eastern flank because, and wait for it, smugglers sent helium balloons into Latvia. And these helium balloons were carrying cigarettes because they're cheaper in Belarus than in Latvia. So I'm pretty sure you can down helium balloons with darts, maybe. You don't need to spend billions on drones, but here we go. And of course, Rearm Europe, which is the policy that, they recalled it Readiness Europe because of the optics of warmongering is important. So it mobilizes 800 billion euro for the war industry, while cutting social spending, of course, public investments for social purposes. And what's really interesting is that member states are allowed to indebt themselves for militarization beyond the arbitrarily set 3% budget cap. Romania, for example, has the highest budget deficit in Europe, 9%. And Brussels keeps telling us we need to implement austerity now, yesterday, all the time. And the government, which is basically a bunch of Milei fanboys, are very happy to do it. But also at the same time, we are welcome to borrow through the safe mechanism of the EU 16.5 billion euro to develop the war industry. This is second only to Poland. And this is not free money. It's money that will be repaid in time by the population. But then, until then, it will flow into Rheinmetall. It will flow into subsidiaries of Israeli weapons manufacturers, such as Elbit, which also deepens Europe's complicity with the genocide and the occupation. And they all love to come to Eastern Europe because labor is cheap, unions are weak, the pollution stays there, there is no organized anti-capitalist left. So please, the Western anti-capitalist left, make sure you come and help us. And governments are friendly towards global capital. And if there is a risk that they aren't, they cancel the elections or they interfere with elections. I think you said there is no guarantee that arms sales will continue long enough to maintain this rearmament boom. But in my view, the main market of weapons is war. So this makes it clear to me that by betting on this single crop war economy, they are also betting that they will be able to maintain at least the Ukraine war going. Are you worried about the spillover of the conflict, notably in Eastern Europe? I know you don't like to make predictions, but do you see a trend? Because people do worry in our region, and the population at large is radically pro-peace, pro-diplomacy, negotiating with Russia. Because, as we like to say bitterly, the West usually brings the technology, but we bring the infantry. So we'll get the weapons, but we will be the ones dying on the front.
Yes, it's an enormously important question, which I don't think I was able to touch upon enough in the lecture. What I do want to clarify is that the current remilitarization plans are a pseudo-solution to something that is a real question. So I in no way want to deny that there is an issue of what European strategic autonomy actually looks like. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, of course, there was a short window of opportunity where there were all kinds of alternative, specifically European plans that were floated before, let's say, the American drive to the east and the bid for hyperpower, as they called it, basically shut down all those opportunities. That question is still around us. In the sense that I think the current remilitarization pretends to solve all kinds of problems it's actually not going to solve. So on the one hand, as I said, it's not going to make Europe militarily independent because many of these payouts will go to American defense contractors. There's obviously just also the inefficiency of the European procurement system, which is so highly decentralized that you have an Italian, then a French company producing the same things, maybe not at very high quality, and then everyone is spending. So, for example, if you add up all the European budgets together, they're actually much higher than the Russian budget and even the American budget. So Europe as a whole, if you take all these aggregates, already spends much more. It's simply because it's an addition or an aggregation of all these separate spending strategies that it looks so low. Basically. And yes, there is now an increasing danger that the solution which European policymakers think they found to the industrial crisis is military Keynesianism. To say, European industry is no longer competitive, it's losing out against China, it's basically delayed this reckoning with its own export model, but we can solve this by basically turning all the industrial production into arms production. I mean, there are crazier and less crazy versions of this argument. That is certainly the tendency in which it's headed. The problem there, of course, is that people don't buy tanks in the way that they buy cars. You don't drive to holiday with a tank. And yes, you do then presuppose that there's going to be a constant demand for these weapons, which presupposes, of course, a perpetual zone of conflict somewhere. And these are things that cannot really be said out loud, but I mean, the American defense industry, which is, of course, notoriously corrupt. So this is the other thing, is that industrial policy for the armaments industry is very difficult because it's such an immensely nepotistic and corrupt industry. But it obviously also relies on the perpetual nature of these conflicts. A war has to happen somewhere if your entire export model is no longer about cars, but about military equipment. And that does mean even if people do not consciously realize this, that some of these companies will insist that some conflicts have to last longer than they could last. That means that the kind of diplomatic options that are available will not be explored as fully because there is now a vested interest in actually keeping the war going. And I think the very dangerous dynamic you've seen in the last 2 years, particularly around the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is on the one hand, there are many Europeans, like, for example, von der Leyen, who have never seriously actually explored what it would mean to look for a diplomatic route, particularly 2 or 3 years ago. But now something internal has changed in Russia as well, namely that the Russian war economy has shown itself to be more stable than presupposed. The sanctions have actually not sucked all the oxygen out of Russia and have actually allowed them to pivot towards China and completely redirect their economy. And at the same time, now there are new constituencies for the war economy in Russia, where people are actually benefiting socially of what's happening. And this means that on the Russian side, there is less interest in peace, because it seems that the war economy is working and is paying off. And then with remilitarization on the European side, the interest in peace is also less, because the idea is now that we turn industry into armament. One other thing I'd mention is that even if you talk about it in purely logistical terms, namely, for example, what are the tools or the weapons that are most used in the current Ukrainian war, they're not exactly the kind of things which the European arms industry is particularly specialized in now. So, for example, Kiev is now a drone capital. It's very easy and very cheap to build these kind of drones. Mines have shown themselves to be very, very important in the conflict. So even if you're talking about this in terms of Ukrainian defense needs or military needs, the kind of spending that's happening in Europe now is not aimed at that. It's aimed at very old, antiquated industries that have been around for a very long time and are not necessarily producing the most high-grade weaponry. So it's also just irrational. It's not even a real response to the kind of problem that is being addressed. So in that sense, I would say you can have a principled objection to militarization, but you can also have an internal objection to it on its own terms, namely, this is not even going to work by its own standards. So we might be against it as such, but you're not even going to do what you think you're going to do. And I think that's an important point of critique to make.
I hear contradictions sharpening, which is always good news. I think I'll end before I open it up to the public. I'll try to tempt you into a bit of revolutionary optimism, even if it's long term, because we've seen historic levels of engagement around Palestine, and sometimes in parallel with it, sometimes together against austerity and militarization. Let me remind you of the 140,000 people that were out in the streets less than a month ago. And through the question of Palestine and through militarization, more and more people are becoming aware that imperialism is fundamental to capitalism, and Rosa Luxemburg would be very happy about this development. They're understanding that today's empire, the US, will stop at nothing to destabilize the entire world in order to maintain its power, and Israel is central to that project. People understand also that the imperial boomerang is coming home, that what was tested in the colonies in terms of repression, exploitation is arriving in Europe. Think of the police routinely beating up peaceful demonstrators in Germany, in Antwerp, in Brussels. Think of the sustained attack on workers' rights, like increasing the retirement age here in Belgium to 67, in other places to 70. Cutting unemployment benefits to force people into underpaid jobs, underfunding healthcare and education. All of these strengthen the bourgeoisie because they make exploitation easier. And the answer to an organized bourgeoisie is an organized working class. But how do we make sure that the anger in the streets stays mobilized? And here, of course, militant trade unions are key, but also that it translates to long-lasting victories, clearing the path towards a much better world where children aren't killed in Gaza or in Brussels parks, where 66-year-old migrant workers don't die on construction sites, as happened to a Romanian in Rome just the other day, may he rest in power, but that he's living his best life in retirement somewhere, where youth doesn't leave school semi-literate and jobless, and where half the world isn't on fire due to the climate change caused by capitalism. And we certainly must overcome US rule and move towards a multipolar world, but it takes more than that. Now it takes an entirely new mode of production, one in which the economy is in public hands, where the green transition is centrally planned for the benefit of the people and not of corporations, where the bourgeoisie is starting to fade away and the parallels with China are not accidental. How do you think we could keep going in that direction using the current moment of widespread mobilizations? How do we not lose the momentum? Is there a way? Or are you pessimistic about this as well? And we're going to see another round of missing revolutions? Like in
This question is above my pay grade, as they say. I think I'm not qualified to give the satisfactory answer to this. I will be very shameless and plug a book. So I will be very commercial. But there is indeed a clear sense, and there's even data about this, that, once again, I talked about the Your Party example in the UK. There is a burst of political energy compared to the 2000s and the 1990s, which is enabled obviously just by the 2008 crash, but also about the decreasing costs of political expression, mainly through the internet, which means that it's now much, much easier to mobilize, and a lot of people find their way into political activity much more quickly than it was before. And it obviously has had like beneficial effects, particularly on some established left-wing parties. And it's also very clear that also the PTB here has been able to garner some of the energy of those protest movements into its own institutional structure. There is also just like a question about how to render that political energy more permanent and more durable. And that has proven a much more difficult question. And if you look, for example, at the Palestine protests, there is very clearly a massive majority that wanted to mobilize and wanted to do something about the genocidal assault that was happening. But again, there's a question of institutionalization, or how the kind of leverage can be built up that can actually stop the war machine, both also from the sponsorship states such as the US, but also in Europe. And there, it's very clear that that is just very, very hard to do. And I think the power differential is so enormous also compared to the 20th century that you can have enormous protests. So I'm just going to give the typical example that in the summer of 2020, after the killing of George Floyd, 25 million Americans took to the streets. So that's an enormous number. That's the highest ever in terms of protest activity in American history. It's much higher than anything you saw in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. So purely in quantitative terms, it's an enormously effective demonstration of the power of numbers. But then if you look at where, let's say, this movement for racial justice stands 3 years later, you kind of have to admit that no institutional infrastructure is actually left. So everyone went out and went back in again. So there's not actually anything that crystallized in terms of organizations. And the actual massive social problem it was addressing, namely not just the carceral complex, but also the specific status of the American police force as a kind of substitute for what was a non-existent welfare state, that also hasn't been addressed. And of course, there's reason to be optimistic about parts of what's happening in the US, but in general, I think the American social crisis is only getting worse. And once again, the biggest protest movement in American history has not tilted that power balance. And that means that the kind of political energy you're talking about is very easy to release nowadays. It's omnipresent. It finds all kinds of channels that were not available before. I don't think there's any sense that we should somehow long back for the previous situation. It's very good that it's easier and cheaper to politicize nowadays. But the question of institutionalization is very hard because there are new kinds of constraints on collective action in the 2020s or just in the 21st century. And I think translating that political energy into a real long-term institutional project that asks itself the question, not how are we going to abolish X tomorrow, but how am I going to contribute to a project that might not even happen in my own lifetime? Maybe my grandchildren will be the first to actually see the fruits of this. Yes, that requires a kind of spirit of humility and of sacrifice, which is difficult nowadays because we live in such an instant, real-time and rapidly evolving public sphere, that culture of patience is very difficult to find. So you can get 25 million people in the street for a summer, but then if you want to address the kind of systemic underfunding of the American welfare state, that might be something that has to happen over decades rather than 2 months. So yes, it will take a long time. I'm very sorry.
It's a long road, yes. We're almost running out of time because we have to be mindful also of the interpreters. I'm going to open the floor for a few questions from the public. Please keep them focused. No comments, just questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi. Thank you for the talk and the discussion afterwards. I'm a bit surprised your proposed solution, or one of the proposed solutions, is to found new parties or restructure parties, because I think what you described as hyperpolitics and the succession of anti-politics is exactly the case of that is ephemeral, right? The moment the issue tries to institutionalize itself, it ceases to exist. We've seen this both on the broad left spectrum, whatever that means, or on the right spectrum as well. I'm thinking of the Gilets jaunes in France or something. Then the moment of trying to become a party ceases to exist, basically. And one of the reasons for this, there are many obviously, but one of the reasons has to be that the participation models that currently states do offer, like petitions, like referenda, like whatever, are seen to be much more, the requirements for these are much too high. So the way of channeling that need of participation is seen of doing, okay, let's go for protest, let's sign a petition, let's do a shitstorm, because this is something effective, so there's something that's self-rewarding, and that seems to be doing something, even if it's lacking any outcome afterwards. But it's giving the gratification that all the state-wise participation models give. So my question basically is, can parties really accommodate this?
Yes, I think they can. Yes. And I mean, when founding new parties, this is why I talked about the kind of hybrid between the dinosaur and the more contemporary species. There obviously are new parties that are already around, but they often don't look like the kind of traditional parties that we know from the 20th century. So they have this digital model where they don't actually have proper members, they only have followers. I mean, there's a very spectacular example in the Netherlands of Geert Wilders' Freedom Party that didn't win, but actually still got a lot of votes in the last one. There's one member of that party, it's called Geert Wilders. You can't become a member of it, you have to become a follower. So even as new parties are being founded, they reflect the new kind of environment in which they're launched. What the point about the foundation of a party, it can't just be registering a party that runs for elections. It has to be the question of an entire organizational infrastructure in which indeed you accept that people could no longer commit to a party in the way that they could in the 20th century, as you did to a church in some ways. But at the same time, a model in which your participation in the party is purely optional, is only short term. There's no clear internal hierarchy. There are no clear procedures. There's all kinds of options to do digital voting. I mean, yes, those parties come and go very quickly. I mean, they rise with one cycle and then they disappear. I think, once again, the Dutch elections are the best example of this. They have a multiplicity of parties, some of them which are quite young, but most of them actually die after, let's say, one electoral cycle because they simply can't survive. And the idea that somehow today people are so distracted and they can't bring themselves to commit to anything that runs across this very short media or electoral cycle, that I simply don't believe. There are enough examples of party activity in which people can commit themselves to long-term organizational work without, as I say, of course, expecting that the Mamdani campaign could have been run without a social media component. So it's not a plea against the idea that people should not have a party with a digital strategy. It's a plea against the idea of a digital party as such. And of course, the reason that I say founding new parties, I mean, you can also take over existing parties. So that's what Corbyn tried with Labour in the UK. But the perennial problem with Corbynism within the Labour Party is that it never properly purged the apparatus of the old guard. And so the old guard remained in power. They continued to sabotage even attempts to win elections with that party. And once then Corbyn lost his election, they immediately pushed him out. So the taking over of new parties is interesting, but it's shown itself to be quite risky. And this is why I make the claim for the foundation of something like new parties. I'm certainly not the only one to say this. I don't pretend any originality. But when I talk about new parties, it cannot be this type of personalistic, purely media-driven, let's say, digital vehicle that then participates in 1 or 2 elections, and then 5 years or 6 years later, you don't hear a word about it again. It has to think in a long-term perspective, basically.
I think we take one more.
Sort of related to this, one thing that seems quite characteristic of Belgium and Brussels to me is a very active and very institutionalized civil society, which has a very long history, especially in Brussels as well. It's very diverse, very well subsidized as well. But at the same time, it also seems quite impotent, maybe. So I was curious about your thoughts on their role in our current situation, let's say, and also their role in this sort of alternative you propose, because we've talked a lot about like mainline politics and then the masses, but not about civil society at all. Yeah.
Yes, and I think this is once again a question where the Brussels exceptionalism or Belgian exceptionalism becomes very important. So Belgium is indeed unique that many of the institutions that in neighboring countries have been completely destroyed or shriveled, like for example labor unions, but also all kinds of civil society organizations, actually continue to function still relatively well. So the unionization rate in Belgium, I think, actually climbed up in the last 10 years from like 55% to 60%. That means that the majority of wage earners in Belgium are actually members of a union, and that is also translated by the fact that there is this very active civil society. Now, the fact that you mentioned subsidized already indicates the structural impotence and weakness itself. And actually, one of the effects of the continuing absence of a Brussels government is that funding is being sucked out of this system, and rather than the civil servants not receiving salaries, it's actually there where most of the layoffs are happening. So it's in, let's say, structurally subsidized civil society organizations that get money from the state that can now not get any new funds because there's no government to actually give those funds. They're really the weakest link, and they're the first place where victims can actually be found of this crisis. The issue with relying on this layer for, how shall I say, as using it as the main basis for the strategy I'm describing, is that the type of civil society you're talking about has survived partly and also mostly, I'd say, because of state funding. They no longer have members, or they no longer have a kind of dues-paying membership that can support them. And that makes them very vulnerable. Because once you then have a government that doesn't want to finance them, or once there is no government to finance them, they basically have to fire people. And that means that if they are so strongly attached to the state rather than to society itself, that makes them very open to this type of attack. So it's not an argument to exclude them or to say that nothing can be done with them. I think the fact that they're still there is obviously enormously important. But also on the Flemish level, they've now taken an axe to many civil society organizations, and it's very clear that organizing resistance to these kind of austerity cuts from within that civil society is very, very, very difficult. So once again, it's not an argument against them. It's just a question of what is their structural weakness in the current situation and what kind of strategy is possible on that basis, on that weakness.
Sir?
Yeah, so I love your analysis. I love your wink to China. I love your annoyance about the pro-US part of the elite. But I think you have one major Achilles heel, and you haven't addressed it yet. Yeah. And that is the politics of decline. So how would you mobilize people if this is a 150-year project? Why wouldn't you say, okay, let it be? When you look at Zoran yesterday in New York, it is really about optimism. It's about saying we're actually fucking going to do it.
Well, there's a question whether he'll be able to do it.
So, but let me give it very simply to you. From a left-wing perspective, is it so bad to deflate, to let capital just move out, to enjoy life, to be an open-air museum, have a lot of time, fuck the pressure? Well, I'm just giving this to, there must something like pleasure in it.
So a bit like the Michel Houellebecq vision of Europe, where Europe becomes one big museum for Asian tourists who then have all the purchasing power and they can visit all the beautiful cathedrals. And I guess we'll have to work in the cafes and like escort them and guide them through the cities. There will not actually be any industrial employment anymore here. And yes, maybe Europe becoming a museum is not the worst. Japan has experienced that type of decline for the last 30 years, and in many ways, I think Japanese decline has been more graceful and more interesting than American decline. At least it's not as loud and as hysterical. That's very true. But at the same time, the point about the politics of decline is not an argument against radicalism or against ambition, but it's about just accepting certain limits or a modesty in what it means for Europe not to be in the driving seat of history anymore in the 21st century. And I think that's also a good thing. It's just the fact that we're now been fully released from this chauvinism. We're no longer actually determining how world affairs are run. The most important decisions are actually made in Beijing or in Washington at the time, and we are secondary actors. Now, many people find that highly traumatic. In many ways, it releases us from a certain kind of centrality, which I don't think Europeans have always used in the best way. When Europeans were in the driving seat, I mean, the 20th century was, rough. It's quite an ambiguous century in many ways. And now we're no longer in that position. Maybe that's good. But there is, of course, the question, relative decline, not absolute, but yeah, definitely relative decline. I do think there's a choice between varieties of decline. And once again, the difference between Japan and the US is very striking there. I'm not saying that Europe should go for Japan or the US, that's the option. I'm just saying there is variety within the variants of decline I've talked about, and how you opt for a different variant is politically mediated. It's a political choice. And I think that the kind of post-historical museumified Europe you're now selling as maybe not the worst of all worst worlds or bad worlds, I think we're underestimating just how difficult to digest that world is going to be for the majority of Europeans. So if you look at the last 10 to 15 years of European politics, there are a lot of really interesting things happening. I mean, look at Italy, which has also been declining. I don't think the Italian response to decline has been particularly beautiful to watch. I think it's more pleasant to live in Italian decline than in American decline, definitely. But still, Italy is not in the best place it's ever been. And the question then becomes, okay, how do we politically negotiate what kind of decline we're opting for? Can the decline maybe be softened? Can we, within the modesty we now have to assume, maybe find an option that is also still productive? So Europe is not going to drive the green transition. It's not going to decide on what the green transition looks like. But Europe still has a lot of money. It has a lot of expertise. It has an enormously talented and highly educated population. And it can use all this expertise to basically maybe help the real agents of world history to make sure that we don't all cook in the planet's juices in 20 to 30 years. I think that will be wonderful and the best version of decline I can propose.
Before we move on to the reception, I'd like to first of all thank the workers who made all this possible, the people at the door, the people at the bar.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
The people doing the sound, the lights, the filming. Our wonderful interpreters.
Yes, indeed, also for the interpreters.
Please join the great mobilizations that are coming up at the end of November. We're having a few days of striking and ending on the 26th of November with a general strike, which is a beautiful thing. Please believe we can still win this, but we all have to be mobilized and organized. Join a party, my party, join a movement, join a union. Thank you to the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung for the initiative, to many more returns of the lecture series. Thank you, Anton, for a great discussion.
And thank you to Oana for hosting as well.